Hey guys, Lee here. Today I am going to use gouache paint to make this cup study and share a little bit about my experience with gouache and just generally what I know about it. If that's something that you are interested in, you can kind of view it as a beginner's guide to gouache. So stay tuned and let's just jump right into it. So I am using Holbein Gouache, which is a pretty decent brand. I don't know if it's the best brand. I've only used two types of gouache, rather two brands of gouache, and that is this Holbein Gouache and the Reeves brand gouache, which is a lot cheaper than the Holbein. The reason I'm using Holbein right now is simply because I gave away my Reeves gouache. It's not quite as good quality. And I just didn't need two sets of gouache, but the Reeves gouache did serve me well when I had it, and I wouldn't say that you are hindered or prevented from learning the qualities of gouache by using a lower grade of gouache paint. That being said, let's jump into what gouache is. Gouache is a water-soluble paint that can be used both transparently in the manner of watercolors and opaquely in the manner of acrylic paints. Unlike acrylic and watercolor, it dries to a matte finish, similarly to the way chalk paint might dry. In fact, I would not be so far-fetched to view gouache as just that chalk paint. So if you're comparing it to watercolors, watercolors use a gum binder which adds to the transparency of the pigments, and gouache uses a chalk binder which causes it to be more opaque and to dry matte finished. So if you don't know what opaque means, it basically just means that you cannot see through it. So if you were to paint over something with a thick application of gouache, you would not be able to see the layer underneath. So here I'm just doing a few swatches. The first of each color is going to be more of a watercolory kind of application, and the second is going to be that opaque finish that gouache really is famous for. So personally, I tend to use gouache in a more opaque manner just because I already have watercolors to fulfill my transparent needs. There are quite a lot of artists out there who will use watercolors as a base for their gouache paintings and then go over with gouache. Some things to note about gouache are when it dries, it's not permanent. So what this means is that even after if it's dried, if I add water to that dried application, then that paint is going to reactivate and become wet again. So that can be really great if you want to continue to blend layers that have already dried, but it can be a hindrance if you are putting really wet layers on top of another, and especially if you're trying to glaze. I really don't recommend glazing with gouache. The general rule of thumb here is to work thin to thick. So your bottom layers, if you're going to use bottom layers, you're going to start with your thinner applications, and as you finish off your piece, then you're going to get more and more opaque with a thicker application as you go along. So here I'm just sketching out my cup study while my gouache paint dries so that I can now show you how gouache can be layered opaquely on top of itself. So here you can see the white goes right on top of that gouache paint, and you can't see through it. It's just a nice line of white. Now I will say for those bottom two swatches, I didn't quite let it dry all the way, so it did mix a little bit with that top layer. So that's what's going to happen. If you layer wet into wet, it is going to mix a little bit, and if you layer on top wet on top of dry, then it is going to layer opaquely. So here I'm just using my 4 colors and the white to jump into this cup study. So you can see here that gouache can be used in a very traditional way. I kind of view it, here's my kind of layout of how I think of gouache in relation to other paints. It's water soluble like watercolors, obviously, and you can even make an entire gouache painting as if it were watercolor paint. And it can be opaque. The richness of the paint is honestly more similar to oil paints, in my opinion, than it is to acrylics. And a lot of people will compare, they'll say that gouache is a cross between acrylics and watercolor. And I can definitely understand that. But I really think that gouache, in terms of the way you lay it down and use it, is more similar to oil paints. And the reason I think that is because oils are rich and thick, and you often, because they take such a long time to dry, you're able to blend for a long time. And you're able to blend for a long time with gouache as well, not because it takes a long time to dry, but because it is reactivatable. So once it's dry, you can add wet paint on top of it and continue your mixing endeavors. So again, it's all up to you whether you view that as a pro or a con. Now, if you really love that matte finish of gouache paint, but you hate the fact that it re-wets, you might want to look into something called acrylic gouache. And this, to me, is definitely more like acrylic paint rather than watercolor paint. In fact, I don't even view acrylic gouache as gouache per se, because of the fact that it's simply matte drying acrylic paint. So it has an acrylic binder, not a chalk binder, but with a matte finish when it dries. So, and I may be slightly off in my description of that, but that's generally how I understand it. It has that acrylic binder in it, which causes it to dry permanently, versus the regular gouache that is rewettable. So here you can see I'm just laying base layers of color to my cup, and now that it has dried, I am adding the highlights and the texture on top of that. And you can see how really easy it is. There are parts in this where I'm blending those lighter colors in with the bottom, and then there will be parts later on where I add thick highlight layers to really make it pop off the page. So it can be a really fun experience using gouache. It's very popular among illustrators, mainly because the fact that it is matte means that you can scan it and photograph it without there being a glare. So it's an excellent option if you are going to be scanning your artwork and printing it. Now, the downside to gouache as a finished product is it's not going to be the most durable piece of artwork, meaning it's not going to be able to withstand a lot of mistreatment or abuse because of the fact that it is water soluble. So it's not necessarily recommended as a great medium for producing art that you are going to sell the original of. Now, of course, buyers may still want your gouache pieces. I think it's pretty common to see online artists selling gouache pieces, but just be aware that these pieces are more fragile and more likely to be damaged, especially if they get wet. So just something to think about. But anyway, that is about the gist of my knowledge about gouache. I haven't used it a ton, but I do enjoy it, and I think that if you have the ability to try it out, that you should. And yeah, that's all I have to say. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you'd like to see more like it, and comment down below if you have any questions or comments. Anyway, I'll see you guys next time, and I hope you have a really, really, really wonderful and safe morning, day, evening, or night. Bye.